The most expensive thing in any luxury showroom is never the car. It is the moment someone judges the wrong person. The first golden rays of an autumn morning stretched across miles of harvested fields as Walter Hayes guided his weathered pickup truck down a quiet country road. The old truck had carried him through more than 2 decades of planting seasons, summer storms, and winter mornings before sunrise. Its faded green paint had long surrendered to time, but its engine still answered every turn of the key with dependable confidence. Walter smiled as he rested one hand on the worn steering wheel. At 74 years old, he had learned that reliable things rarely needed to impress anyone. Behind the cab sat a small toolbox covered with dust from yesterday's work, while a pair of muddy work boots rested on the rubber floor mat beneath his feet. His denim jacket had been stitched twice along one sleeve, and the collar had softened after countless years beneath the sun. To strangers, he looked like an ordinary farmer finishing another ordinary week. Only those who truly knew him understood that appearances often tell the smallest part of a person's story. After nearly an hour of driving, the quiet farmland slowly gave way to wide highways lined with office buildings, restaurants, and polished storefronts. Towering glass windows reflected the bright blue sky as Walter carefully followed his navigation toward one of the largest luxury automobile dealerships in the region. He parked several spaces away from the entrance, taking a moment to admire the elegant building standing before him. Inside the showroom, rows of perfectly polished luxury sport utility vehicles shimmered beneath carefully positioned lights. Every vehicle looked more like a sculpture than a machine. Walter quietly adjusted his jacket, picked up a folded envelope from the passenger seat, locked his truck, and began walking toward the entrance with slow but steady steps. As the automatic glass doors opened, cool air carrying the scent of fresh leather and polished wood welcomed him inside. Soft instrumental music floated through the showroom, while sales consultants spoke confidently, with well-dressed customers examining vehicles worth more than many family homes. Walter paused for only a moment, appreciating the craftsmanship surrounding him before continuing farther into the spacious showroom. His boots left faint traces of dried field dust across the spotless tile floor, a detail that immediately caught the attention of several employees standing near the reception desk. One salesman glanced toward another before quietly smirking. A younger associate followed Walter with curious eyes, clearly wondering whether the elderly farmer had wandered into the wrong building. Walter noticed the looks but showed no sign of discomfort. Instead, he offered a warm smile to the receptionist. "Good morning," he said politely. "Beautiful showroom you have here." The receptionist returned the smile with genuine kindness. "Good morning, sir. Welcome." Before she could ask how she might help, a sharply dressed salesman approached from across the showroom, straightening his designer tie as his eyes moved slowly from Walter's worn boots to his faded jacket. Walter simply stood there with calm patience, holding the folded envelope in one hand while quietly admiring a brand-new luxury sport utility vehicle displayed beneath the showroom lights, completely unaware that the next few minutes would reveal far more about the people around him than about the man they believed they had already judged. The salesman stopped a few feet in front of Walter Hayes, offering the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. His polished shoes reflected the showroom lights as neatly as the expensive vehicles surrounding them. A silver name badge on his tailored suit read, "Brandon Collins, Senior Sales Consultant." Brandon glanced briefly toward Walter's weathered pickup truck through the glass entrance before returning his attention to the elderly farmer standing quietly beside the newest luxury sport utility vehicle. "Good morning, sir," Brandon said with professional politeness that already carried a trace of impatience. "Can I help you find something today?" Walter nodded warmly. "I certainly hope so. I have been reading about your new Summit Edition sport utility vehicle. I would like to learn more about it." Brandon blinked almost imperceptibly before looking once again at Walter's faded denim jacket and boots still carrying traces of dry field soil. "The Summit Edition," he repeated. "That is one of our premium models." Walter smiled. "That is exactly why I came." Brandon folded his hands comfortably in front of him. "Perhaps you would be more interested in some of our certified pre-owned inventory. We have several excellent options that offer similar styling at a much lower price." Walter remained perfectly calm. "I appreciate that, but I came to see the new one." Brandon forced another polite smile. The vehicle you are looking at starts well above $100,000 once most customers add the available packages. Walter nodded slowly. It must be built very well. The salesman chuckled quietly. It certainly is not designed for farm work. A few nearby employees exchanged amused glances before quickly pretending to organize paperwork. Walter simply continued admiring the vehicle without responding to the remark. He slowly walked around the sport utility vehicle, studying the craftsmanship with genuine interest. His fingertips lightly brushed the polished paint without leaving a mark. "Beautiful engineering," he said softly. "May I ask about the towing capacity?" Brandon appeared surprised by the question, but answered anyway. Walter followed with another question about suspension performance on gravel roads. Then another about long-distance fuel efficiency. Each question became more specific than the last. Brandon answered mechanically, although his confidence gradually faded. The old farmer clearly understood far more about vehicles than he had expected. Even so, the salesman remained convinced that Walter had no intention of making a purchase. "Sir," Brandon finally said, lowering his voice, "I do not want to waste your morning. Most customers considering this model schedule appointments before arriving." Walter looked at him kindly. "Did I need one?" Brandon hesitated. "Not exactly. It simply helps us prepare." Walter smiled. "Well, I have already driven almost 60 miles to get here. I would not mind waiting a little while if someone is available." Brandon glanced toward another couple entering the showroom wearing expensive designer clothing. His expression immediately brightened. "If you do not mind," he said, "I should probably assist those clients first. They have an appointment." Walter nodded without the slightest sign of disappointment. "Of course. Please take your time." Brandon walked away without offering another word. The receptionist watched the exchange from her desk, quietly feeling uncomfortable. She carried a fresh cup of coffee toward Walter. "Sir," she said gently, "while you are waiting, would you care for some coffee?" Walter accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Thank you very much. That is very thoughtful." He settled into a comfortable chair overlooking the showroom floor, sipping his coffee while watching sunlight dance across rows of beautifully crafted automobiles. Around him, conversations continued, sales presentations unfolded, and polished shoes crossed spotless floors. Yet Walter never once checked his watch or showed frustration. He simply waited with the quiet patience that only a lifetime of planting seeds and trusting seasons could teach. Walter Hayes finished his coffee slowly, placing the empty cup neatly on a nearby table instead of leaving it behind. He quietly thanked the receptionist once more before returning his attention to the gleaming sport utility vehicle positioned beneath the showroom lights. Time seemed to move differently around him. While customers arrived and departed carrying folders and brochures, Walter remained perfectly content simply observing the craftsmanship that had first brought him there. He studied the precision of every body panel, the elegant stitching visible through the windows, and the careful engineering that transformed steel, leather, and glass into something both practical and beautiful. The receptionist glanced toward him several times throughout the next 20 minutes. She noticed that he never wandered aimlessly or behaved like someone passing time. Instead, he carefully read every specification displayed beside the vehicle, occasionally unfolding a small notepad from his jacket pocket to compare measurements he had written before leaving home. A young technician walking through the showroom noticed the notes and smiled politely. "Researching before making a decision?" he asked. Walter returned the smile. "Good tools deserve careful study before they become part of your work." The technician nodded respectfully before continuing toward the service department. Nearby, Brandon Collins had become increasingly occupied with another couple, enthusiastically describing optional trim packages and premium interior finishes. Every so often he glanced toward Walter, who still waited without complaint. Brandon quietly shook his head as though convinced the elderly farmer simply refused to leave. Another salesman approached him. "Your friend is still here," he joked quietly. Brandon smiled without looking up from his paperwork. He will probably ask for a brochure and head back to the farm. Neither man realized the receptionist had overheard the conversation. She frowned slightly, but chose to remain silent. Walter, meanwhile, walked toward a display showcasing different exterior paint finishes. He paused beside a deep metallic green color that reminded him of young corn stretching across rolling hills after spring rain. "That one is beautiful," he said softly to himself. The receptionist heard him and smiled. It has been one of our most popular colors this year. Walter nodded. Some colors never go out of style because they remind people of home. Before she could answer, the quiet atmosphere inside the showroom shifted almost instantly. Outside the glass entrance, a sleek black executive sedan turned into the parking lot and stopped directly in front of the dealership. Several employees immediately noticed it. Conversations grew quieter. One manager straightened his jacket while another hurried toward the entrance. Brandon quickly excused himself from his customers, smoothing his tie and checking his reflection in the polished side of a nearby vehicle. "The regional director is here," someone whispered. Within seconds, the relaxed pace of the showroom transformed into carefully organized professionalism. Sales consultants adjusted display folders. Managers exchanged brief instructions. Even the background conversations softened as everyone prepared for the unexpected inspection. Walter simply watched with quiet curiosity, holding the folded envelope comfortably beneath one arm. The automatic doors opened once again, allowing cool autumn air to drift into the showroom. A tall man in a tailored navy business suit stepped inside, carrying only a leather portfolio. His silver hair reflected years of experience rather than age, while his calm eyes surveyed the showroom with quiet confidence instead of authority. Employees immediately gathered to welcome him. The regional director acknowledged them politely, but before anyone could begin the scheduled tour, his attention drifted across the showroom and settled on the elderly farmer standing peacefully beside the metallic green sport utility vehicle. For one brief moment, the entire room seemed to stand perfectly still as recognition slowly appeared across the regional director's face. The regional director stood motionless for only a heartbeat before a warm smile slowly spread across his face. Without waiting for the dealership manager to greet him or begin the scheduled inspection, he changed direction completely. Every employee watched with quiet confusion as he walked past rows of luxury vehicles, ignored the welcoming committee assembled near the entrance, and headed straight toward Walter Hayes. Brandon Collins noticed the unexpected movement and hurried forward, assuming the executive wished to examine the newest display vehicle. Instead, the regional director stopped directly in front of the elderly farmer. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then the executive extended both hands with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Hayes," he said warmly, "I have hoped I would see you again someday." Walter's weathered face brightened with genuine surprise before he returned the handshake. "Daniel Brooks," he replied with an easy smile. "It has been a long time." The showroom fell completely silent. Brandon stared at the two men, unable to understand what he was witnessing. The dealership manager looked equally confused. Daniel Brooks laughed softly. "Longer than it should have been." Walter nodded. "Life has a habit of keeping people busy." Daniel looked at the envelope tucked beneath Walter's arm before asking, "What brings you here today?" Walter glanced toward the metallic green sport utility vehicle. "I came to learn about that one. It looks like it could handle country roads better than my old pickup." Daniel smiled. "Then we are going to make sure you learn everything you want to know." He turned toward the dealership staff, his expression remaining calm but noticeably more serious. "Has someone already been helping Mr. Hayes?" Brandon immediately stepped forward. "Yes, sir. I spoke with him earlier." Daniel studied Brandon's face for only a second before quietly asking, "Wonderful. Which model did you recommend?" Brandon hesitated. "I suggested some certified pre-owned options." Daniel looked back toward Walter. "Was that what you requested?" Walter answered gently before Brandon could speak again. "No. I asked about the Summit Edition, but everyone has been very busy this morning. I do not mind waiting." There was not a trace of accusation in his voice. His words were simple, honest, and free from resentment. That quiet grace somehow made the silence inside the showroom even heavier. Daniel slowly nodded. "I understand." He then addressed the dealership manager without raising his voice. "Please delay the inspection for a few minutes." "Of course, sir," the manager replied immediately. Daniel turned back toward Walter with genuine warmth. "If you will allow me, I would like to personally show you every feature of the vehicle." Walter chuckled softly. "You have an entire dealership waiting for you." Daniel smiled. "They can wait a little longer." Several employees exchanged uncertain glances. None of them had ever seen the regional director postpone a scheduled inspection for any customer, let alone for an elderly farmer wearing worn boots and a faded denim jacket. The receptionist quietly smiled to herself, sensing that the story behind this meeting reached far beyond business. Brandon remained standing beside the display vehicle, replaying every word of his earlier conversation with Walter. The confidence that had filled him only minutes before slowly disappeared, replaced by uncomfortable realization. Daniel gently opened the driver's door of the Summit Edition and invited Walter to take a closer look. "After everything you once did for me," he said with sincere gratitude, "showing you this vehicle is the easiest part of my day." No one in the showroom yet understood what Daniel meant, but every person present could already see one undeniable truth. The man many had mistaken for an ordinary farmer had just become the most respected customer in the building without asking for special treatment or reminding anyone of his worth. Edit. Daniel Brooks gently rested one hand on the roof of the metallic green sport utility vehicle before looking back at Walter Hayes with unmistakable appreciation. "I have wanted to thank you properly for many years," he said quietly. Walter smiled with modest confusion. "You already thanked me once, Daniel. That was more than enough." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Not for what you gave me." Every employee standing nearby remained completely silent. Brandon Collins lowered his eyes, sensing that the answer he had been searching for was finally about to arrive. Daniel invited Walter to sit comfortably inside the driver's seat while he stood beside the open door. "Most people here know me as the regional director," Daniel began. "Very few know where I started." Walter laughed softly. "I remember a skinny young man who showed up at my farm wearing boots that looked newer than his hands." Several employees smiled politely, unsure whether the story was meant as a joke. Daniel laughed as well. "He is right. I had just graduated from community college. My father had passed away the previous winter, my mother was working 2 jobs, and I needed any honest work I could find." Walter listened quietly, never interrupting. Daniel continued. "I knocked on 6 different farm doors asking whether anyone needed help during harvest season. 5 people politely turned me away. Mr. Hayes was the 6th. Walter looked down with a thoughtful smile. "You worked hard." Daniel nodded. "You hired me before asking about my experience. You told me something I have never forgotten." Walter remained silent, allowing the younger man to continue. Daniel looked around the showroom before repeating the words exactly as he had remembered them for nearly 3 decades. "A person's willingness matters more than what their hands already know." The sentence settled gently across the showroom. Even customers browsing nearby vehicles quietly stopped to listen. Daniel continued. "You paid me fairly, taught me how to repair equipment, trusted me with responsibility, and never treated me like I was just temporary help. More importantly, you restored my confidence during a season when I had almost lost it." Walter smiled warmly. "You earned every opportunity after that." Daniel shook his head once again. "No, you gave me the first opportunity. Everything else grew from there." Brandon quietly stepped backward, replaying his own conversation with Walter only minutes earlier. He remembered looking at worn boots instead of character, faded denim instead of wisdom, and dust from farm fields instead of decades of honest work. Daniel turned toward the dealership staff without raising his voice. "Luxury is not measured by leather seats or polished paint. It is measured by how we treat people before we know who they are." No one answered because no one needed to. The lesson had already reached every corner of the showroom. Walter gently stepped out of the vehicle and carefully closed the driver's door. "Daniel," he said kindly, "please do not make anyone feel embarrassed because of me. We all have days when we see too quickly and understand too slowly." The regional director smiled with quiet admiration. "That is exactly why I have never stopped learning from you." The receptionist discreetly wiped away a tear before returning to her desk. Even the dealership manager lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Walter then unfolded the envelope he had carried since arriving that morning. Inside rested a neatly organized list of vehicle options, measurements, and handwritten notes he had prepared over several weeks. He handed it to Daniel with a gentle smile. "Now," he said, "perhaps you can help an old farmer choose the right sport utility vehicle. I finally think I have found the people who know enough to answer my questions." Daniel Brooks carefully studied Walter Hayes's handwritten notes with genuine admiration. Every page reflected thoughtful preparation rather than impulse. Precise measurements, towing requirements, fuel economy estimates, maintenance questions, and handwritten comparisons filled the neatly organized sheets. Several notes referred to livestock trailers, uneven gravel roads, winter weather, and long drives between neighboring counties. Daniel smiled as he finished reading. You have already done more research than most customers who walk through these doors. Walter chuckled softly. When a person plans to keep something for a long time, it deserves careful consideration. Daniel nodded. That explains why your pickup truck is still running after all these years. Walter looked through the showroom windows toward the faded green truck resting quietly in the parking lot. It has never promised to be impressive, he replied. Only dependable. Those words seemed to linger in the air long after Walter finished speaking. Daniel gently handed the notes back before inviting Walter to explore every feature of the Summit Edition. Together, they opened storage compartments, adjusted seating positions, examined suspension settings, reviewed towing technology, and discussed engine performance without once mentioning price. Walter asked practical questions rather than glamorous ones. He wanted to know how easily replacement parts could be obtained in rural communities, whether the suspension remained comfortable on uneven dirt roads, and how well the heating system performed during severe winter mornings before sunrise. Daniel answered each question carefully, occasionally asking engineers from the service department to provide additional technical details. Employees watched with growing respect as the conversation unfolded between two men who valued substance far more than appearance. Brandon Collins remained nearby, quietly observing every moment. He slowly realized that Walter had never been trying to impress anyone. He had simply wanted honest answers before making an important decision. After nearly 40 minutes, Walter stepped away from the vehicle and smiled with quiet satisfaction. It is an exceptional machine, he said. I believe it will serve my family well for many years. Daniel smiled. Would you like to discuss the purchase? Walter nodded before reaching into the inside pocket of his denim jacket. Instead of producing a credit application, he carefully unfolded a certified bank check that had already been prepared several days earlier. Daniel glanced at the amount and smiled knowingly. You certainly came prepared. Walter laughed gently. I was hoping I would find the right vehicle today. The dealership manager looked genuinely surprised as Daniel quietly confirmed that the certified check covered the full purchase price, including the options Walter had selected. No financing discussion was necessary. No approval process was required. Everything had been thoughtfully arranged before Walter ever walked through the showroom doors. Brandon slowly closed the sales folder, still resting in his hands. For the first time in his career, he understood that assumptions could cost far more than a missed commission. They could quietly diminish another person's dignity before a single conversation had truly begun. Walter noticed Brandon standing alone nearby. Without hesitation, he walked over and offered a warm smile. Young man, he said kindly, would you do me one favor? Brandon looked up with visible embarrassment. Of course, sir. Walter gently placed one hand on the polished hood of the new vehicle. When the next customer walks through those doors wearing work boots, dusty jeans, or old clothes, ask about their story before deciding what they can afford. Brandon lowered his eyes. I will remember that for the rest of my life. Walter nodded warmly. That is all anyone can ask. Daniel watched the exchange quietly, realizing that the greatest lesson taught inside the dealership that morning had nothing to do with automobiles. It had everything to do with the simple choice to recognize another person's worth long before discovering the size of their wallet. The paperwork was completed without unnecessary ceremony. Daniel Brooks personally reviewed every document before placing the final purchase agreement on Walter Hayes' side of the polished oak desk. Walter carefully adjusted his reading glasses, read each page from beginning to end, and signed with the same steady handwriting that had filled his notebook earlier that morning. Nothing about the moment felt rushed. It reflected the quiet confidence of a man who believed important decisions deserved patience. After Daniel countersigned the agreement, the dealership manager extended the keys with both hands. Congratulations, Mr. Hayes, he said sincerely. It has been an honor serving you today. Walter accepted the keys with a grateful smile. Thank you. It has become a much better morning than I expected. The manager nodded, understanding exactly what Walter meant. Nearby, Brandon Collins remained standing beside the delivery area, still thinking about everything that had unfolded since Walter first walked through the front doors. He watched the elderly farmer thank every employee who assisted him, including the receptionist who had offered nothing more than a simple cup of coffee and genuine kindness. Walter never behaved as though anyone owed him an apology. Instead, he treated every conversation with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning. That simple consistency left a deeper impression than any lecture ever could. Daniel walked beside Walter toward the new sport utility vehicle waiting beneath bright showroom lights. The metallic green paint reflected the autumn sunshine pouring through the enormous glass windows. Walter slowly walked around the vehicle one final time before gently placing his hand on the hood. "It reminds me of fresh fields after spring rain," he said softly. Daniel smiled. "I remembered you saying that earlier, so I asked our detailing team to prepare this exact color first." Walter laughed warmly. "You always did pay attention." Before Walter climbed into the driver's seat, Daniel reached into his portfolio and removed a small framed photograph. "I have carried this with me through 5 promotions," he admitted. Walter accepted the frame with visible surprise. The faded photograph showed a much younger Daniel standing beside an old red tractor, smiling proudly, while Walter rested one hand on his shoulder after their first successful harvest together. The edges had become worn over time, but the memory remained perfectly clear. Walter looked at the picture for several quiet seconds before returning it. "You kept this all these years?" Daniel nodded. "Whenever I doubted myself, I remembered the man who trusted me before I had accomplished anything." Walter gently smiled. "You accomplished far more than you realize." Brandon slowly approached them, holding a neatly folded dealership jacket embroidered with the company logo. "Mr. Hayes," he said sincerely, "our dealership normally gives these to customers during special events. I would be honored if you accepted this one." Walter accepted the gift with appreciation. "Thank you, Brandon." The young salesman hesitated before speaking again. "I also wanted to thank you for accepting my apology without making me earn it first." Walter looked at him kindly. "The best apologies are proven by tomorrow's choices, not today's words." Brandon quietly nodded, knowing he would remember that sentence for many years. As Walter started the engine, the smooth sound of the new vehicle filled the delivery bay. He lowered the driver's window and looked toward everyone gathered nearby. "Take good care of the next person who walks through those doors," he said with a warm smile. "You never know how many lives they may have already changed before meeting you." The automatic showroom doors slowly opened as Walter drove into the bright autumn afternoon, leaving behind far more than the purchase of a luxury automobile. Without realizing it, he had planted another quiet harvest, one that would continue growing long after the tire tracks disappeared from the parking lot. The weeks that followed quietly transformed the dealership in ways no quarterly report could have predicted. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. Brandon Collins greeted every visitor with the same welcoming smile, whether they arrived in a luxury sedan, an aging pickup truck, or a family van that had clearly traveled many miles. He no longer looked first at shoes, jackets, or watches. Instead, he introduced himself, listened carefully, and asked thoughtful questions before mentioning a single vehicle. His conversations became slower, more genuine, and surprisingly more successful. Customers sensed the difference immediately. Many left handwritten compliments praising the warmth of their experience rather than the features of the automobiles they purchased. Daniel Brooks noticed the shift during his next scheduled visit several months later. Instead of reviewing only sales figures, he spent the morning quietly observing interactions throughout the showroom. He watched Brandon patiently explain safety technology to a retired schoolteacher. He saw another consultant carefully help a young couple compare family vehicles without pressuring them toward a more expensive option. The atmosphere felt different. Luxury remained visible in every polished surface, but kindness had quietly become the dealership's most valuable feature. During a staff meeting that afternoon, Daniel asked whether anyone had suggestions for improving customer service even further. Brandon raised his hand. "I have an idea," he said thoughtfully. "What if every new employee spends one full day simply welcoming guests before learning anything about sales? They should understand that every customer deserves respect long before any discussion about prices or commissions begins." The room grew quiet before several employees nodded in agreement. The dealership manager smiled. "That may be the most valuable training program we could create." Daniel looked around the conference room with quiet satisfaction. "Then let us make it part of every employee's first week." The proposal was approved immediately. A few days later, a framed photograph appeared inside the employee training room. It showed a peaceful country landscape beneath an autumn sunrise, accompanied by a simple sentence printed beneath it. Every person carries a story that cannot be seen from the parking lot. No name appeared beneath the quotation, yet everyone inside the dealership knew exactly who had inspired it. Meanwhile, Walter Hayes returned to his farm, where life continued much as it always had. The new sport utility vehicle soon carried fencing supplies, veterinary equipment, groceries, grandchildren, and neighbors who occasionally needed transportation into town. Walter treated the vehicle with care, but never with pride. To him, it remained exactly what he had hoped for, a dependable tool that made daily life easier. One crisp Saturday morning, he drove into town for breakfast at a small local diner. As he parked outside, Brandon unexpectedly recognized the vehicle while passing by on his day off. He walked over with a broad smile. "Mr. Hayes," he called warmly. Walter looked up and smiled just as warmly. "Good morning, Brandon. How have you been?" Brandon laughed. "Busy learning." They shared coffee together for nearly an hour, talking not about automobiles, but about harvest seasons, family traditions, honest work, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from treating people well. When they finally stood to leave, Brandon thanked Walter once again for the lesson that had quietly reshaped his career. Walter simply placed a gentle hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Remember," he said with calm kindness, "every harvest begins with a single seed that someone chooses to plant." Respect works exactly the same way. Brandon watched the elderly farmer drive away beneath the bright autumn sky, realizing that some teachers never stand inside classrooms, yet they change countless lives simply by living with quiet dignity every single day. Nearly a year passed before Daniel Brooks returned to the dealership for its annual leadership conference. By then, the changes that had begun with one quiet morning had spread far beyond a single showroom. Customer satisfaction had reached the highest level in the region, employee turnover had fallen dramatically, and dozens of handwritten letters filled the display case near the reception desk. None of the letters praised discounts or luxury features. Instead, they thanked the staff for making people feel seen, heard, and respected. As Daniel walked through the entrance, he paused beside the framed quotation that had become part of every employee's daily routine. New consultants often stopped to read it before beginning their first shift, reminding themselves that the value of a customer could never be measured by appearance. Brandon Collins, now promoted to sales team leader, welcomed Daniel with the same warm handshake he had once reserved only for important executives. Daniel noticed something else immediately. An elderly couple wearing simple work clothes entered the showroom carrying mud on their boots after a morning on their ranch. Before anyone else could react, Brandon walked directly toward them with a genuine smile. "Welcome," he said kindly. "Thank you for visiting us today. What would you like to learn about?" There was no hesitation, no judgment, and no assumptions. Daniel quietly smiled, realizing that the lesson Walter Hayes had planted had continued growing exactly as a good harvest should. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove several miles into the countryside before turning onto the familiar gravel road leading to Walter's farm. The field stretched peacefully beneath the golden light of late afternoon, while the metallic green sport utility vehicle rested beside the old pickup truck outside a weathered red barn. Walter looked up from repairing a wooden fence and smiled as Daniel approached. "You always seem to arrive around harvest season," Walter joked. Daniel laughed. "Perhaps because that is when I remember where my own journey truly began." The two men sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the fields, sharing coffee poured from an old metal thermos. They spoke about family, changing seasons, and the simple satisfaction of honest work. Finally, Daniel reached into his briefcase and removed a small wooden plaque. It had been crafted by a local artisan and engraved with a single sentence. Walter read it quietly before smiling. "Respect is the first thing every customer should receive, long before the keys." Daniel nodded. "We placed those words in every dealership training center across the region. Thousands of employees will read them every year." Walter looked across the fields where autumn wind gently moved through rows of harvested crops. "I never imagined a conversation inside a showroom would travel that far." Daniel smiled. Kindness usually travels farther than the person who begins it. As evening settled across the countryside, Daniel prepared to leave. Walter walked beside him to the driveway where both vehicles stood side by side, one old and one new. each representing a different season of life, yet sharing the same dependable purpose. Before climbing into his car, Daniel thanked Walter one final time. Walter simply shook his hand with the same quiet humility he had shown from the beginning. Neither man believed they had changed the world. They had only chosen respect when it would have been easier to make assumptions. Sometimes that is exactly how lasting change begins. The richest person in any room is not the one surrounded by the most expensive possessions, but the one whose character leaves every life a little better than it was before.